Hi everybody, welcome to the Herefordshire Gardener channel. My name's Aaron. Today I'm going to be showing you how I plant out my David Austin roses in the garden. Hopefully you'll find the video useful. If you do, give it a like. If you want to see more content, subscribe to my channel. So as you can see here, we've got The Poet's Wife by David Austin. I think introduced in 2014. Gorgeous yellow blooms, buttery yellow, with a strong fruity fragrance with hints of lemon to match. This rose is only going to reach around about 3.5 to 4 feet to being a shrub rose. I'm really looking forward to getting her into the ground and seeing her mature. I've had her in this pot now for probably about 4 weeks. Purchased her about 4 weeks ago from one of the local garden centres. So she should be fine to go in the ground. I think sometimes with the David Austin roses, you know, you don't know whether they've just been potted up, in which case there won't be much root mass in that pot, and you've got to be really careful with those ones when you're taking them out, because you know, if you cause significant damage to the roots themselves, the plant can go into shock, and we need to be minimising shock where possible. So if you're not sure whether your rose has recently been potted or whether it was potted you know, several months back and has just been, you know, growing roots in the garden centre while it's been it's waiting to be bought by somebody, just keep hold of it for a few weeks in the pot, maybe 3 weeks, and it'll have a little bit more time to establish some roots. This here is the area where I'm planting out the roses. So as you can see, I've got a couple in already. I think at the end there is Summer Song, and then next to Summer Song is the Ancient Mariner. I shall be doing some videos on reviewing those roses for you in due course. This is a 2-foot bed, sort of in the middle of the rose room it starts, and then it stretches along this area and sort of meets up with the 4-foot bed, which then continues around in an L shape where you've got the pergola arch, and then it ends there in the middle again, and then this is basically going to be repeated on the other side. You can see over there I've already got roses in all the way around, so I'm just basically finishing off the planting today. So I'm going to be copying exactly, excuse me, what I've done down there with these 2 roses, except this one is going where that bamboo stick is. They've been measured. They're approximately 10 feet apart. They don't have to be 10 feet apart. This is just my design. I plan to companion plant them next year, so lots of room for different plants to go in between that I feel will go really well with my roses. So the plan is to show you how I remove the grass, which tools that I use, how I prepare the soil, how I put the rose in, how I finish it off, and what I do afterwards, and moving forward. So in terms of things that you're going to need, or the things that I use anyway, is a nice narrow spade. This is not a special spade, it's just a bog standard one, but it's pretty good and it does the job very well. A garden fork, I'll explain why we're going to use that, and also one of these lawn edgers, absolutely fantastic tool. I think this one's by Draper, wooden handle, and it's very comfortable to use. Basically this is going to be used to remove the top layer of the grass, just as you would edge a lawn, and the shape of that blade just makes it such an easy process to get the grass removed. Obviously you'll need a rose. I've got the Poet's Wife as mentioned earlier. I use a barrow, a wheelbarrow, just because when I'm taking the grass off of there I need somewhere to put it. If you're obviously working in a bed, you can just pop it on the soil and clean up after, but I like to stay as clean as possible as I work, so that's what the barrow is for now. And then under the barrow, sorry, we've had a lot of rain when I started filming, hence the umbrella on the floor, but I've just put the feed under here. So we've got Blood, Fish and Bone by Westland, and in a bag somewhere under there is the rose pellet food, which is Westland again. This is just an all-purpose rose feed. I don't have any access to any aged manure, I know a lot of people recommend using manure or leaf mold or just something with organic matter in. I think the key thing with the manure and the leaf mold is that it's had time to decompose on average, you know, a couple of years, so that it's ready and available to feed your rose. I wouldn't be advising putting any fresh manure on the roses. I think it can burn the new roots. It could be a bit too strong for them. And obviously, you know, if you don't live by a farm or you can't get access to manure that you can age, or access to aged manure, do the next best thing and use what I'm using. Just go and get yourself some fertilizer, and I'll show you how I use that as well, to minimize any damage to the rose, particularly the new roots. So the hole is eventually going to look sort of similar shape to this. Don't know if you can just see the strings that I've put. I've just chopped down some bamboo sticks, put two at that end, spaced them 2 foot apart, and then I've run string all the way along and made sure that the string at every point down here measures 2 foot apart, which it should do in theory if the end canes are in the right position, and it does. It measures 2 foot. The idea is then to take the surface layer of grass. As you can see here, I've removed a rectangular section. I just made it big enough really so that there was a big enough planting hole for the rose, because the hole that I'm going to be digging is not going to just be the size of the pot. It's actually probably from about here to the end of there, so maybe 2 or even 3 times the size, because I want that soil to be nice and loose for the roots to grow into. I want to be able to amend it with the food that I've just shown you guys. And so, you know, the amount of grass that I'm removing is proportionate to the hole that I'm going to be digging. The rest of this grass will be removed eventually where there isn't a rose. So if you look, for example, between this one and this one, there's a section of grass there. That's obviously not going to be there eventually, probably later this year, or I may even leave it until next year when I come to companion plant. Bare soil is never good. It's never good to leave soil bare. If you've ever sort of read about soil health and soil life, you'll understand that soil is a living environment, and there are a lot of beneficial organisms within the soil itself. And so, you know, I treat my soil as a living structure, and where possible, put a mulch on top. A mulch, I'll explain to you why we do the mulch a little bit later in this video and what its benefits are, but it's another reason why I'm leaving this grass for now. I could remove all of that and have it looking the same as this and put my mulch on top, but that's more work that's not needed right now, whereas I want to focus on getting these roses in. So this is the section that we're going to be working on, and I'm now going to mark out with this edging tool a similar rectangle and take the grass off and show you what that looks like. And this tool literally couldn't be any easier to use. You just pop it where you want it to go, pop a foot on, and down it goes. And then what I tend to do is just pull back just to release the grass from that area. Same again. So as you can see, what I've done is I've gone around the outside with this edging tool, which you can see there, just into that line there. And then what I've done is I've sort of sliced that up across this area. I'm now going to go across this way, and what that's going to do is it's going to leave me with little square patches, okay, which are then easy to remove. For example, if you look at this one, when I lift that, the whole thing just comes out a bit like, I don't know, a lasagna in a dish, for example. And all you've got to do then is just take that out. I should have my gloves on really. So this is one of the sections of grass removed. As you can see, I've chopped this entire space up into sort of square shaped pieces like this. It just makes it very easy to remove this in sections. I wanted to show you something really interesting actually on this. I don't know if you can see this sort of white powdery residue under the soil. This is actually a fungal network, a beneficial fungal network, and it just goes to show, you can see all these grass roots that are in here. This fungal component, this fungus should I say, is actually forming a relationship with the grass roots. So it's taking in nutrients from the soil as well as water, and it's basically swapping these ingredients, if you would, with the plant roots for things that it wants from the plants, like sugars, for example. And so they form this beneficial relationship with one another. So it's always good to see this type of fungus in your soil already. It shows that what the rose is about to go into is a very nice infrastructure, which is good to see. You can actually inoculate or add the mycorrhizal fungi to your roses. There are specific fungi available for roses. So, you know, you just basically dust a bit of that on the root ball before you put it in, and put a little bit in the planting hole, and hopefully over time that fungi will grow out into the soil and around the plant roots, and it essentially just extends the plant's reach, if you think about it like that. They're almost root-like when you look at them under the microscope. They're very tiny and thin, you know, like a very small version, if you would, of a blade of grass, just reaching out a bit like a plant root. And you know, because they are much smaller than plant roots, the mycorrhizal fungi, these structures are known as hyphae, and you know, they can get into very small spaces, whereas the plant roots might not be able to, and so it just increases the plant's reach to water and nutrients, which is obviously a good thing. So coming back to this hole, what I'm going to do, I could just stick that whole thing in the barrow, which would make my life a lot easier and probably make digging this hole a bit quicker. But look at all the soil that is there, and look at all this roots, which, you know, I call organic matter, that's underneath there. All I need to do really is take my spade, or this edging tool, and you know, pop it around about here and push down, and it will remove the base of this soil off, so this can go back in the planting hole, and I'll just pop the top of the grass in the wheelbarrow ready for disposal a little bit later. But yeah, there's no point in wasting this material. It just makes sense to keep as much of it as possible. And these roots here, they shouldn't really regrow. What they'll do is they'll actually break down in the soil over time, and they'll just provide more organic matter for the roses and the other plants that are going to be growing here. So, you know, it offers also, it opens the soil structure up, having these roots there as well, rather than it just being really compact soil. So yeah, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to strip that off now, and I'm going to do the rest of the bed and show you what it looks like when I'm finished. I just wanted to show everybody this mycorrhizal fungi network again, because you can really see it well here. Don't know if you can see those white sections throughout the entirety of the soil. That's the mycorrhizal fungi network, and there'll be a lot of hyphae there that we can't see, so a lot of it's not visible to the naked eye, but when you see collections of it like this, it's very evident that it exists. Just so nice to see it there in the soil already. And it goes to show that the soil life is doing what it's supposed to do, and it's happy. So this is the hole with the with the grass removed. In the barrow there you can see the soil, the grass rather, and as you can see, I've tried to save as much of the soil as I could by basically slicing off a carpet of grass from the top. Probably could have got a little bit more of that if I wanted, but to be fair, there's enough soil in that hole. I actually won't be using all of that once I dig down. I end up with about half a barrow of really good, we're on medium clay soil here, so this is absolutely perfect for roses. As you can see, it crumbles so nicely. It's so satisfying doing this, just to give this lovely soil, gorgeous colour as well. But this is what it's like all the way down. It retains water really well, but we're on a slight slope in the garden all the way down from the top to the bottom, so this drains really well also, which is important when you're thinking about planting your roses. Generally speaking, roses, they love clay soil. It's full of lots of minerals, nutrients, and as I said, it sort of retains moisture better. And you know, roses, they like a good sort of moist base, but not a soggy soaking satin water base for their roots. So this is really good for roses. As far as I'm concerned, it's as good as it gets. So this is the hole, and as I said, that minus the glove is the grass from the top. I've got an area in the garden that I just go and basically plonk this down and let it just decompose, let it grow, let it do what it wants to do. If I need anything for like my veg beds in the future, you know, if I'm doing a raised bed, for example, this is really good material. Once I've left it, just turn it over and just drop it into the bottom of that and build it up, so nothing goes to waste. So this is the dug hole, and what I've done is I've actually dug down further than what you can see there and backfilled. So we've got dug over loose soil ready for the roots to grow into. Probably goes down about another 6 to 8 inches than what you can see. That's the soil, would you believe it, that I dug out of just that little hole. It's filled that barrow. I've not broken that up yet, and I'm going to show you what I do with that before I put it back in here, because we do not want to be putting soil back in lumps like this. That's no good for the roots. That's going to leave a lot of massive air pockets if you fill the hole with soil like this. We need to break this down into smaller components, something that resembles a bit more like this, and that way you'll get close contact with the roots once we put the plant in the hole, and the roots can grow into this. Roots don't like it when there's massive air pockets under the ground, because the roots will dry out in that section. They got nothing to grow into. So we need soil contact all the way around and throughout the planting hole. So very important when it comes to backfilling, as we call it, putting soil back in the hole. You need to make sure that the soil you're putting back in that you've dug out has been broken down enough that it's able to form, you know, a nice comfortable hug around the base of the rose and in the rest of the hole itself. Don't want it too fine, you know, we don't want this ground like flour, because A, it won't drain as well, and B, it will suffocate the roots. Roots, especially new growing roots from this rose, are going to need oxygen, and you know, to introduce oxygen into the soil, obviously digging this hole for a start is going to allow it to aerate. But the risk that we run is, you know, if we grind this down too fine, we'll end up with a very powdery mixture that will just, once wet, will go like potter's clay, in my soil anyway, at least. And then, you know, you've got an issue on your hands then, because there's less oxygen down in the ground for the roots. So I tend to go no finer than sort of this, and as you can see, there's a mixture of large and small lumps, and when they come together, you see there'll be air spaces between, which the roots can take advantage of. So I'm now going to show you how I amend the planting hole with the fish blood and bone and the rose fertilizer pellets. So I mean, I'm not massive on measurements, there is instructions on the box, but I tend to just put about a handful of this blood, fish and bone at the bottom of the hole, and I also put in the hole about half a handful of these pellets. I don't want to over fertilize the rose or cause any burn to the new roots, so I don't want to overdo it in the soil. Remember, I've got clay soil, so there's a lot of minerals and nutrients in this soil anyway, but you know, generally about half a handful of the pellets go into each hole for me. And then it's important to just take your edging tool and just, sorry, it's hard to do this one-handed, but just amend it into the soil so that it's not all in one space. I want the roots to go out and find it when they're in there, and just give the rose a little bit of a head start. You've got a little worm there, that's another good sign in your soil, is when you've got worms. Worms eat decaying material and they poo out what are known as worm castings. Worm castings are excellent food for any plants. So, you know, it's another good sign that we've got good soil, is we've got, you know, Jim and his friends living in this area, which is nice to see. So you can see I've turned that over now. You can barely see the stuff that I've put in there. And just make sure I've got a nice flat base, and again, getting rid of those big clumps. Might take a little bit of work if you spend time putting them in properly, but they'll pay you in dividends after, when you get healthy multiple blooming roses that you can look at and smell all day long. I think it's worth the small amount of effort to make sure that you're doing things properly. So I know the rose is going to be sitting there. I know deeper down there's a good layer of broken down soil like this because they dug down deeper. So the next step is going to be taking the rose out of the pot, and the easiest way to do this, I've seen many people doing this different ways. That's essentially where the rose is going. You can see this is the level of the grass. The mulch is actually gonna, the mulch which I use, bark chippings, is going to start here and go up to the level of the grass. So there's about 2 to 3 inches depth there. The soil is actually here, and as you can see, it's just slightly higher than the pot. If you look at the bottom of this rose, what they've done in the garden centre actually is they've done this pretty well. The mulch, this is the chipping that they've put on top of this pot, is actually burying the crown of the rose. So what we can see here is a dead stem, unfortunately, but you know, the rest of the rose is fine, so I'm happy with that. Sorry, just get this into focus, if it will. You can see 2 nice healthy green canes. They've got a little bit of dieback on the top, but the rest of the plant is fine, and I'll sort that dieback out when I come to prune these later, early next year. So looking at, sorry, I'm losing track. Looking at the base of this pot, you can't actually see the crown of this rose, which is good. That's how I prefer to bury my roses, just so that the soil level comes just above the crown by maybe an inch. And the crown is the point at which your rose, whichever variety it is, as this one is the Poet's Wife, is grafted or glued on, if you would, to the rootstock. So the rootstock is a particular rose that's known for growing very healthy, vigorous roots. We then graft on a scion. In this case, it's the Poet's Wife, as I mentioned, and you know, the roots won't reject this scion. They'll allow it to grow on top, and so you'll have essentially 2 different roses. One giving you the amazing blooms that you're after above ground, that's the bit you can see, smell, touch and feel, and the one underground which is giving you the healthy roots. That's how the majority of the roses are sold, as I understand, in the UK and across the world. Sometimes they will grow them on their own roots, so that's where the roots below the soil and the roots above, the roots below the soil, sorry, and the growth above is all of the same plant. There are advantages and disadvantages. So with this one, which is most likely grafted, sometimes you can get what we call suckers that come up. A sucker is a stem coming out of the soil that comes from the rootstock, not the scion or the top growth. And the issue that you're going to have there is you're going to have a different rose essentially growing up, which will be very different to the one that you purchased and the one that you actually want to see. And my advice, if you see those, is to follow those suckers back. They're usually very vigorous. They usually stick out and grow massive. The leaves tend to look different to the rose bush that you've got. They're very vigorous, and if you're left untouched, they will sap all the energy from your actual current rose, and you'll end up in a few years, or no time at all, with a completely different rose bush, and yours unfortunately will have died. So I would say trace them back. If they're not coming from the crown or the union, which you can't see in this video, I'm sorry about that, but it is a bit further down in this pot. If you can't see them coming out of that, and if they don't look like your current rose, if they're coming lower than the union or they look different, just cut them off as close to the base as possible. You may get them resprouting, and you just got to keep on top of it and keep an eye out on your rose and make sure, you know, if you do see anything like that in future, that you just cut it off with a clean pair of shears. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to actually turn this pot out in a second. I'm going to put my gloves back on because I don't want to get pricked by any of these thorns at the bottom. And what I tend to do is, underneath the pot are the drainage holes. There's one on each corner with these David Austin pots. I actually just push my finger very gently in each of them, and what I find that does is it breaks the seal in the pot, and it actually releases the rose better. I see some people turning them upside down and giving the pot a good tap, and that tends to work as well, but this is my preferred method and it works well for me, and I'm not banging the rose and potentially disturbing anything too much. The key thing with this next step is that you're just really careful not to damage the roots. The roots will need a little bit of teasing, so you know, with plant roots, And what they'll tend to do is they'll hit the inside of the pot and they'll start to grow round the pot. Okay, now if you've got a plant, a rose, any plant in fact, that has become what we call root bound, and that is where it's filled this pot with roots, okay, and the roots are basically in the shape of the pot when you look at them on the outside. If you don't break some of those roots, and you know, when I say break, I mean just take your finger and run it down the side, don't worry about splitting the roots. Actually splitting them encourages them to grow more roots, so you're doing the plant a favour in the long run. But you know, if you have a root bound pot, a root bound plant, sorry, and you pop it into the ground or into a new pot, in fact, even if you don't tease those roots, the plant will just continue to grow roots in the shape of the existing container, because that's the way the roots have been programmed to grow, and you won't get very many that come out into your new planting hole or new potting space. So very good tip is to just break some of the root bound roots if you see them. If, like in the case of this rose, I don't anticipate it'll be root bound, I will just gently tease some of the roots. I'm not aiming to disturb them a great deal, just tease them out a little bit, just to let them know really that they've come out of the pot and they're going into this wonderful new space that they can explore and grow into. So I'll come back once I've situated the rose out of its pot and talk about the next steps that I'm going to take. As you can see, this is the poet's wife rose now in the hole, and if you look, you can see there are some roots here at the side, you know, and these can be teased. If you look, that's what I mean by teasing. You're just basically encouraging the roots to come out into the soil. You don't need to be too vigorous, just a little bit is fine. I've actually teased the bottom of this pot, so I'm not going to bother with these ones up here. They will naturally find the soil that I'm going to backfill with. One really important step that I should remind you all when you're thinking of planting a rose into a pot or into soil, just make sure that you thoroughly water the rose in its pot before, a good sort of hour before, which I've done with this one, to make sure that that soil is nice and thoroughly wet. Once you start backfilling this, okay, it can be very difficult to rehydrate that root mass, because the outer soil or the backfilled soil can potentially make it harder for you to get water into the center. It's not impossible, and you can do it, but you know, the advice is to make sure you give it a very good watering in its pot an hour before, and that'll just mean you are absolutely certain with 100% that that plant has got enough water in its immediate vicinity, which will give it the best chance really to root out into its new environment. So, you know, very important step, just make sure that you water thoroughly. What I'm now going to do is I'm going to start backfilling this with the soil from the wheelbarrow. I'm going to prepare that soil and show you how I do that in a second. And then what I do, just to let you know while we're down here, is, you know, when I get so far up the rose, I then add another layer of the bloodfish and bone and the pellets, and that is why I only added a small amount in the bottom, because I actually layer my fertilizer up the rose. So I start with the bottom layer, and then when I have got about halfway up, I put another fine layer, nothing too much, just a bit, just to encourage those roots to come out into this area. And then also what I do is when I get up to the sort of top level of the pot, in this case that's the level that I'm going to come to, because the graft is already buried. If the graft was here, I'd probably bury this rose a little bit higher up. You essentially just want to see the stems sticking out, and what that does is, you know, number one, it allows for more new healthy canes to come out of your graft site and come up through the soil, and hopefully give you some nice healthy new canes, so you can start to develop that lovely open vase shape on your rose bushes. And the other thing is, you know, if you live in an area where you get cold winters or a lot of wind, particularly if it's an exposed site, it stops the rose first of all from rocking as much, because, you know, if this graft site is not buried deep enough, the rose can actually rock at the top, which can cause the roots to detach or become loose underneath, and that can make for a very unhappy rose indeed. So that's one of the reasons. And then the main reason I think I would do it this way, we do sometimes get some cold winters here in Herefordshire, UK. We're actually zone 8B, which is not too bad, but we have had some very cold winters in recent years, and by burying sorry, the focus is not very good today, by burying the graft, you know, you are offering that little bit of extra winter protection. You know, if the top growth dies off because of cold or frost, at least you've got the beating heart, if you would, of your rose graft still under soil, from which new shoots can sprout come the following spring. So it's an insurance policy basically. So anyway, I'm going to start backfilling. I'll explain to you when I'm putting the fertilizer on top, and then hopefully we'll get to the position where we're at the top and I can explain the next steps. Okay, so the next step is preparing the soil to go back into the planting hole, what's termed as backfilling. So as you can see, this is where your old David Austin pot comes in handy. It's a little bucket really. What I tend to do to re-prepare my soil, I don't want it in this form, I don't want it bulked up, so I just crumble it back into the pot. You want to be giving your rose the best fighting chance. And going back to what I said earlier, you know, when you're backfilling around the roots, you want a nice close contact with the roots. You don't want something like this against there with nothing at either side of it. You know, that is not an environment that's good for root growth. You want something that resembles this, something that is just fine enough that the roots are always in contact with something, so they can receive the nutrients and the moisture and the structure with which to grow through and support themselves. So, you know, I'm gonna basically continue doing this with this soil, fill this up, take this, start putting it around the rows until I get to about halfway, and then I'm going to put on some more of this fertilizer. I'll show you that step, and then we're going to backfill to the top of the hole, and we'll come back and have a look at what that looks like. So I'm just in the middle of filling the hole, and I just wanted to highlight why it's really important to break down the soil, you know, like this, and to put back in to the hole as the backfill. So when I took the soil out of the planting hole, I literally just put it into the wheelbarrow as it came out, so in these big clumps, in small clumps, and it's just sort of gone into the barrow and settled as it is. Now if you look here, you would think that you know, this soil goes all the way down and, you know, it's just soil all the way through, but if you look, as I'm starting to pick the soil up and break it, you can actually see there's a huge hole in there. And you know, that's what we're trying to avoid in the planting hole. We don't want holes like this, air pockets. We want to try and keep the soil broken down. I thought it'd just be good to show you, because on the face of things it looks like it's soil all the way down, but when you start looking into this pile of soil in the barrow, you can see that actually there is a lot of air pockets. So by putting the time in to break it down, I know that there aren't going to be any of these large air pockets within that planting hole. So what I've done now is I've backfilled to about half the planting depth, and as you can see, I've popped in some of this fish blood and bone, just a small dusting around the perimeter. So we're now sort of halfway up the planting hole, and the plant's got nutrients not just lower down but higher up, just to encourage those roots to come out into this space. The roots should go deeper, that's the main aim, but it just provides you know, the roots in sort of the immediate area with access to food as the plant establishes itself. Again, just a very small helping of these general purpose rose pellets all the way around, and then I'll just generally mix them in just a little bit, and then what I'll do is I'll fill the rest of the hole up on my back when I've done that. So here's the finished hole back filled. As you can see, soil is coming nicely up to where it were in the pot. What I need to do now, a really important step, is with using my foot, just go around this at a slight angle and put some pressure on, just to make sure that the soil's in good contact with those roots. So what I tend to do is then to just put my foot very carefully under the plant, just using my body weight, just allow the weight of my body to push down. I don't want to pack it in so tight, and I'm just going to do this all around the planting hole, but paying particular attention underneath the rose bush itself without damaging the rose. I'm just putting some pressure there so I know in and around the base of that plant there's good contact with this soil. What you don't want to do is you don't want to put so much pressure that those air pockets that you've created, those tiny ones, by breaking the soil down, are obliterated. You don't want to do that. I know I mentioned earlier in the video, sorry, excuse the noise, I think somebody's cutting wood. So yeah, what was I saying? With regard to this process, you want to basically put enough pressure that you're bringing the small grains of soil, if you would, that you've created together, so that they help the root structure to grow into the area and the roots have got good contact with that. What you don't want to do is literally stomp this thing down, because you'll quite literally just cause it all to turn into a big concrete rectangle in the ground, which we don't want. So that should be enough firming, and you can feel it. You can feel when you put your foot on it, you feel the ground just gives that little bit, and you can feel it coming together. That's more than adequate, and that'll secure that rose as well, so any wind coming along is not going to potentially knock it out of the ground or rock it on its roots. Now you can see I've backfilled and I've left a gap where the grass level is. That's going to be backfilled with bark, just wood chippings. That's got to be at least 2 to 3 inches there, and I'm going to go and empty this barrow now, because that's the leftover soil. As I mentioned, there's quite a bit. You'd think just all I've taken out is enough to put that pot in, but in theory, because I've taken the top couple of inches off as well, you end up with a lot more left in the wheelbarrow. So that's going into a corner of the garden for use on another project, and then what I'll do is I'll come back when I'm ready to put the mulch on. I'll show you what I do there as well. Right, so I filled the barrow with the wood chips. This is just bog standard wood chips. I think a neighbour of mine asked a passerby who was chopping down some trees if they could have it, so this is all free. I've got it, they got it off of them, I've got it off of my neighbours, and it's been sat on my driveway since January this year, so it's already started to decompose. It's just going on top of the beds, it's not getting mixed in with the soil, so it doesn't really matter what kind of wood chip it is, in my opinion. Just the main function of it really is to suppress the weeds and to retain the water that we're putting into the ground, stop it evaporating off the soil as quick. And also having this layer on top of bare soil, again, one of my earlier points that I mentioned, it's not good to have bare earth like this. Remember, there is life in that soil. When it's exposed to direct sun, which this area is in the rose room, that soil is not going to be very happy for being put under that situation. So by putting a blanket of mulch over the top that's several inches thick, you're protecting that layer underneath, and the soil will therefore be a lot happier for having this mulch on top. So what I'm going to do in a moment is I'm going to take that mulch and I'm going to fill it to the level, pretty much level with the grass around. Before I do, I'm going to pop a small layer. This is what I've done in all of my rose beds that I've planted up. I just take again a small sample of this pellet rose feed and just put a little bit around the rose, just to encourage it to come out, and when those roots do come out, there's available food. Now this stuff, just as a sort of bit of advice, this doesn't actually release any of its nutrient content unless it's wet. So what sometimes I've seen on some videos and some advice on the internet is people are just throwing this down on top of their rose beds and leaving it, and that's all right. It will provide some fertilization because of course it rains, and the rain will come into contact with that, and the nutrients out of these will leach into the soil. But by putting them at this layer under this mulch, they're going to remain wet for a lot longer. And we'll look, another little worm there. Look away if you're squeamish. How cool is that? So anyway, the whole point is just to try and keep this wetter for longer, so it's doing the job that I want it to do. And that's why I put mine underneath my mulch rather than on top. And every year when I come to fertilize my rose beds in spring, I'll actually pull the mulch back, put this fertilizer on top, or whatever fertilizer I'm using, well decayed horse manure for example, and then put the mulch back over the top of that, for exactly the same reason. And also I have 2 dogs, and dogs love the smell of this, and I don't really want them eating it, so another benefit. So this is the rose poet's wife that's now in, fully mulched all the way around. Don't know if you can see, but I've popped it slightly closer to this side of this 2-foot bed because we do have a beech hedge at this other side, and I have left a small pathway down that side for access. These hedges are due to be cut, so they're actually out probably by about 1.5 foot compared to when they're cut back, so that space will be a lot bigger anyway. So that's why she's a little bit over this direction. She is going to grow in every direction though, but as you can see, we've got the mulch on the top of the bed. And one of the other benefits really of the mulch that I didn't mention is, you know, this is organic matter. It is mulch trees when all said and done. It's got carbon in there, lots of micronutrients, and you know, with this over time, the fungi that are located within this will break it down, and that will directly provide nutrients to the soil below and of course the plant roots. So another benefit to mulching. So the final step really, now we've got the rose in and we've fed her and we've mulched, is really the most important step, especially for new roses, is the water. So you know, roses when they first go in, when they're in their infancy stage like this, you've just brought them back from the garden centre, you're eager to plant them in pots or the ground, they're going to need regular watering. A rose of this size, just to give you a perspective, average size that you'd get from the garden centre, is going to need anywhere from sort of 10 to 20 litres of water a week. And on really hot days, you know, you might need to be upping that even more. As long as you've got good drainage away from the planting hole, which I know for a fact exists here. In pots obviously you'd have an inch or so at the bottom of your pot to allow you know, have your pot stood on little pot feet or milk carton tops, just something to raise it off of the bottom, and make sure you've got some good crocks, broken pot that is, in the bottom of your pot to allow the water to escape out of the pot. You know, as long as your drainage is good, I don't think you can overwater the roses. I'd rather overwater than underwater. The only disadvantage of watering too much, particularly in pots, is you can rinse out the nutrients that you've put into the pot in terms of the feed, which, you know, you don't really want to do. So just make sure that you are saturating the soil. So I water my roses anyway, usually twice a week, sometimes 3 times depending on the weather. In the UK we've been having some really hot weather during June. I think we've broken records since they began. So you know, they have received a bit more watering, but the way I water is definitely not on the foliage. I don't want to introduce black spot or encourage black spot, which is a fungal disease, you know, common in roses. So what I tend to do with my hose is I'll set the hose in the ground, I'll turn her on and I'll lock her into position, and then what I'll do is I'll just angle her so she doesn't spray up. You can spin usually your handle on the hose. So if I just pop her like this at this side of the bed, I don't need to do anything else now. I can just step back and leave that hose going. I've timed this to fill a 10-litre watering can, takes on average about a minute for me. So she's gonna get at least 10 litres into this hole today. But you know, normally when I first planted the roses, I will just leave the hose on until I see the water around the perimeter of this planting hole. Seems a bit extreme, but I know then that the water is going deep, and that's my aim. When every time I'm watering my roses, it's not just to quickly sprinkle the top of the mulch just to make it look like I've watered. The idea is to drive this water as far down into this soil as I can, including around the rows, down around the sides of the rows, and around the area where I want the roots to grow in, because I want an environment below this mulch where the roots can go deep. They can go outwards, they can go downwards, but they're going to have access to water because I'm encouraging this water to go deep. If I didn't do that, then the very bottom pit of this planting hole could remain drier than the top. And if you were a root in search of water, you would probably go towards the top because that's where the majority of the water would be. In order to produce healthy roses that can survive on their own, it's better to encourage this water to go deep from the get-go. And then what that will do is it will encourage this lovely rose here to put down deep roots rather than shallow roots, and that will help this rose in the long run become healthier, become stronger, and be able to resist drought a lot better in future warmer seasons, which we're likely to see in the UK given what's happened over the last few years. So I'm just going to leave that down there now. I'll come back and show you what I mean once the watering hole is full, in my opinion. I've finally finished with the hose now, which has been on this area probably for about 3 to 4 minutes, and as you can see, the water has reached the edges all the way around, and this whole thing actually is very well saturated all the way through. And so I estimate if in a minute the hose will fill a 10-litre can, this whole space has had just about 40 litres poured into it. So that is going to drain. It's already draining as we speak. Soon you won't be able to see any water around the edge because it will have gone down and through the substrate of the soil. I've also popped a lovely David Austin label in front, as I do with all of my roses. So there's a reminder really for future years to come of who she is. Although I do keep a list of mine. When we moved to this house in November last year, there are a lot of David Austin roses here by the previous owners who designed this garden 20 years ago. Unfortunately, a lot of them don't have the labels on. The previous owners have kindly given us a list to help identify where the majority of the roses are and what their names are, which was really, really kind of them and very, very useful. But you know, just as a good housekeeping, I would encourage you all, where possible, to make sure you keep the label on your rose and on a scrap piece of paper or on a laptop, anywhere on your phone. Just keep a note of where you planted it, when you planted it, which one it is, just in case, you know, these labels ever break down. The straps that normally come on the plants, the David Austin labels, they're usually at the bottom of the stem. They're also usually really good, and where possible I try not to bury those in the soil or the mulch. But you know, I have one of these with each of mine, these card labels. It's got a lot of information about the rose on the back as well, which I really like. So those go in the planting hole in front of all of the roses. I don't know if you can see, the Ancient Miner's got one over there, and Summer Song's got one too. They all do. So yeah, really good housekeeping. So that's it. That's the rose in. She's watered, she's been fed, she's been mulched. Now she can just relax and grow, basically. So the plan will be to put another one where that cane is, and then that will complete this 2-foot bed because there are only 4 roses going in here. I want to space mine out so that I can put my companion planting in between. That's Ghislaine de Filigonde at the end there. He's going to go up that pergola structure. Absolutely gorgeous rose that one is, and I'll be doing a review on her soon. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed the video. I hope you've learnt something, that it's been useful. You know, at the end of the day, we paid £30 in the UK a time for these roses. I think it's a good investment to make sure that when you're planting, you're doing it properly, and that you understand the ongoing care, particularly in the first 12 months of planting a new rose.